Las Vegas, early 1970s. The Hilton showroom shakes under the thunder of suspicious minds. The orchestra blazes, thousands of fans scream, cameras explode in bursts of white light. It feels less like a concert than a riot of devotion. Elvis at his peak, the king untouchable. And then everything shifts. From the ocean of sequins and champagne, a figure forces his way forward. Not a fan in glittering gowns, not a gambler in a tux. A man in dust-stained boots, his shirt worn thin, his face carved by sun and labor. He isn't here to cheer. His eyes burn with purpose, his jaw locked with defiance. In front of thousands, he shouts toward the stage, words no one can make out at first. But the tone carries fury, not adoration. Gasps ripple through the audience as he grips the edge of the platform, hoisting himself upward. Security lunges, ready to crush the disruption before it mars the spectacle. But before they reach him, Elvis lifts his hand, calm, commanding, and halts them in their tracks. The room freezes. The band falters. Every breath seems to wait on what will happen next. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas, early 1970s. The Strip was glowing with the kind of brilliance only that city could conjure. Towers of neon buzzing in electric colors, billboards stacked on top of one another promising jackpots, drinks, and women. Yet on that particular evening, one building eclipsed them all. The International Hotel, its marquee screaming in gold and red letters, Elvis, one night only. Sold out. Inside, the lobby smelled of perfume and whiskey, of cigars that cost more than some families earned in a week. The casino floor was alive with clinking coins, but it was the showroom, vast and cathedral-like, that pulled every nerve taut with expectation. Velvet seats stretched endlessly, tables stacked with champagne bottles and crystal glasses. Diamonds flashed on women's wrists as if the entire room had been dipped in light. Men in tuxedos leaned back with the ease of Wall Street winners, confident they were part of something no price tag could measure. To witness the king of rock and roll at the very peak of his reign. The band was already in place, brass instruments glinting under spotlights, guitarists tuning quietly. Stagehands whispered final cues. The announcer's voice would be heard any moment. But amid the shimmering luxury, one figure did not fit. He sat 2 rows from the stage, not tucked in shadows, but right in the open, his presence jarring against the polished tide around him. His shirt was worn thin at the elbows, its faded blue once bright, but now dulled by years of sweat and dust. His trousers bore the creases of long days bent in fields, rather than the sharp press of a dry cleaner's iron. His boots were scuffed and cracked, coated with dust that even Vegas carpets couldn't swallow. Guests noticed him. Some whispered behind jeweled hands, others frowned with the faint disgust of people who had paid dearly for exclusivity. How did he get in? The question hung like static in the air. The International wasn't a place where farmers wandered in off the road. Tickets had been scalped for weeks, going for hundreds, sometimes thousands. Yet here he was, seated as if by right. His face was lean, worn by sun, lined more by burden than by age. He wasn't drunk, nor did he carry himself like a crazed fan. Instead, there was a hard stillness in his posture, a weight pressing from the inside. His eyes, pale and unwavering, fixed not on the glittering stage, but on the curtain behind which Elvis would appear. The contrast sharpened with every glance around the room. Laughter rang from tables where women in sequined gowns clinked glasses. Cigarette smoke curled through beams of light, softening the edges of the room into a haze of glamour. Dealers and casino men, used to spotting trouble, lingered near the back, but no one moved toward him. It was as if the crowd collectively waited for the opening chord to erase the dissonance of his presence. And yet, something about him unsettled. It wasn't just poverty against wealth, it was intent. He hadn't come to lose himself in the music, nor to chase the thrill of brushing against celebrity. His stare was too steady, his body too tense. He looked less like a fan and more like a man waiting for judgment. The lights dimmed. A cheer thundered through the room. The announcer's voice boomed, "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley!" The curtain swept aside in a blaze of horns, and the room exploded with applause so loud it rattled glasses on tables. Elvis strode forward, white jumpsuit glittering, cape flowing like a banner. Women screamed his name, men whistled and shouted, cameras flashed. But amid the storm of adoration, the lone farmer didn't rise to his feet. He sat rooted, staring with an intensity that no spotlight could wash away. His knuckles tightened on the edge of his seat. To most, it was invisible, swallowed by the noise. Yet a few in the rows nearby felt the air tighten. They saw him inhale sharply, as though bracing for a strike. They sensed that he hadn't come here by accident. It raised questions no one could answer in that instant. Who let him in past the ushers and security? Was his presence a slip of chance? Or had it been planned, with a purpose only he carried? Elvis launched into the opening number, voice rolling through the hall like thunder. The band was tight, the energy intoxicating. The crowd swayed, clapped, lost themselves. Yet for one man in a threadbare shirt, the music was not escape. It was confrontation. His eyes didn't soften. His jaw clenched tighter. Somewhere in the roar of horns and drums, the first crack of tension was struck, though almost no one yet recognized it. Tonight was supposed to be another coronation of the king. Instead, the stage had unwittingly set itself for something far closer to a reckoning. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the charge was there, silent, invisible, crawling through the air like electricity before lightning. And somewhere in the middle of that golden room, lined with jewels and velvet, a man who smelled faintly of earth and sweat leaned forward, ready to speak into a silence no one had anticipated. The second song had barely ended when it happened. The man in the worn shirt rose from his seat. It wasn't a drunken stumble, nor the giddy leap of an overzealous fan. It was deliberate. He moved with a stubborn steadiness, brushing past knees and handbags, ignoring the hisses of people forced to let him through. By the time the audience realized what was unfolding, he was climbing the steps to the stage. Gasps rippled across the room. At first, many thought it was a publicity stunt. Vegas shows thrived on spectacle. But the look in his eyes, carved hard by years of sun and strain, told another story. Security guards tensed at the edges, their hands hovering over batons, but hesitated, waiting for Elvis's cue. The man's boots thudded on the polished stage floor. His chest rose and fell with the effort of holding himself together, his hands trembling even as his voice broke free, loud, raw, ragged, but unmistakably filled with purpose. "My farm's dying," he shouted, words cutting clean through the electric air. "My wife, my children, they're starving. And you," he jabbed a finger toward Elvis, "you sit on a mountain of gold while families like mine waste away. Do you even remember where you came from?" The crowd, once roaring with cheers, dissolved into chaos. Shouts flew in every direction. Some voices screamed for security to drag him away. Others, quieter but firm, urged restraint, muttering that maybe the man had a point. The contrast was brutal. Sequins glittering under the lights, rings clinking against champagne glasses, and this lone figure, shaking, defiant, standing in threadbare cloth. For a moment, Elvis himself did nothing. He stood still, a golden silhouette in the spotlight, his expression unreadable. The music had stopped. The band froze in place, horns poised mid-air. The farmer pressed forward, his voice cracking but gaining strength with each word. "You forgot us. You forgot the people who sweat in fields, who work until their hands bleed, just to keep food on the table. We buy your records. We filled your concerts. But when the dust storms come, when the banks take the land, where are you then?" The weight of his desperation filled the vast room in a way even the orchestra couldn't have managed. For every guest who rolled their eyes at what they saw as madness, there was another who shifted uncomfortably in their seat, as if something deep and unwelcome had been stirred. Then came the twist, words no one expected. His voice dropped low, thick with something that sounded almost like memory. "My father," he said, steadier now, "helped your daddy after the Depression, gave him work when no one else would. I grew up hearing his name in our house, Vernon Presley. You think I don't know who you are? You think this is some stranger's anger? My family kept yours afloat when times were darkest." A wave of stunned whispers surged across the audience. Some laughed in disbelief. Others froze, uncertain, scanning Elvis's face for recognition. Was this madness? A lie spun by a desperate man? Or was it a ghost from the past, come to confront the king on his throne? Elvis's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with a flicker of something more complicated. Confusion, maybe even recognition. The crowd swelled again, half of them jeering for the man to be dragged off, half leaning forward, hungry to hear more. The split was palpable, like fault lines opening underfoot. The farmer's words sliced through the noise. "You think your music belongs only to the rich? To people dripping in jewels and champagne? Number. It was born where we lived. Bare feet on dirt floors. Mothers praying over empty plates. Gospel songs rising through thin walls. That's where you come from, Elvis. Don't you dare forget it." The guards shifted, glancing toward Elvis, waiting for a signal. They could rush him now, pin him to the ground, erase the disturbance before it became an incident. But still, Elvis didn't move. He watched. He listened. The room trembled with energy. Women clutched their pearls, their mascara streaking from sudden tears. Men barked curses, furious that their night of entertainment had turned into something so unsettling. It was no longer just a show. It felt like a trial. Every second that ticked by pushed the tension higher. The farmer's hand shook as he pointed again, yet his voice remained clear, cutting. "You're not untouchable. You're one of us. And if you can't see that anymore, then all of this—" He swept his arm toward the screaming crowd, the chandeliers, the press cameras. "All of this is nothing but a lie." Somewhere in the audience, silence began to spread. First a few, then many. Their shouting cut short as they realized they were witnessing something they had no script for. Not spectacle, not theater. Truth, naked and searing, in the middle of the most glamorous room in America. Elvis hadn't yet spoken a word, and the longer he stood silent, the heavier the moment became, pressing down on every soul in the hall. For the farmer, the gamble was all or nothing. His anger was no longer just about money or hunger. It was about betrayal, about demanding recognition from a man whose songs had once been the voice of people like him. No one knew what would happen next. Would security drag him off in disgrace? Would Elvis laugh and dismiss him as another madman? Or would something else, something no one dared predict, take place before their eyes? The only certainty was that the night had already shifted, and there was no going back. He moved before anyone else did. One step, then another, as if walking into a wind only he could feel. The room bristled with half-formed shouts, but Elvis raised his hand, not abrupt, not theatrical, simply firm. And the uproar buckled. The band froze mid-breath. Ushers stopped halfway down the aisles. 1,000 throats swallowed the next word they meant to fling. The silence that followed was not empty. It was packed dense with breath and pulse and the hush of air conditioning over velvet drapes. Elvis did not glare. He didn't wear the mask of a star wronged or a king insulted. He studied the man across a few feet of polished stage and let his gaze soften, the way you look at someone who's stumbled in the dark and cut himself on something you left on the floor. The stones on his stage suit threw small points of light along his shoulders, but there was nothing hard in his eyes. He stepped closer, open palms, no rush, and the security men at the wings faltered, waiting for a command that didn't come. "Give him a microphone," Elvis said, voice low and even. The sentence fell like a gavel. Heads snapped toward the soundboard, toward the nearest stagehand. A spare mic appeared from backstage, cord unspooling with a rubbery whisper. Someone whispered, "Is he serious?" And someone else shushed so sharply it sounded like a blade. When the mic reached the farmer's hands, the man pinched it clumsily near the grill, breath fogging the mesh. The greed of the spotlight had climbed his face. Close up, the years of sun and grit showed through in small fissures at the corners of his mouth. Permission robbed him of fury. The accusation that had ridden him onto the stage, the heat that held him upright. Both slipped a little in the light of being asked to speak. His fingers trembled. The first word snagged. He looked not at Elvis, but at the ocean of faces, and the ocean looked back. Elvis didn't rescue him, not yet. He nodded once, slow, like a coach who knows a player can stand on his own if given a second to find his footing. Then, in a tone that carried clean to the back row without strain, he said, "I'm a worker's son, too. I know debts. I know a bare icebox." His chest rose on a breath that steadied his next sentence. "But tell me, did you come here for money or for truth?" The question clipped the cables of the room's certainty and left it hanging. A woman near the front, lacquered hair perfect until that moment, pressed her fist gently against her mouth. Mascara wet the edge of her lashes. At a table midway back, a man in a dinner jacket muttered to his date, and the date shook her head, eyes locked on the stage. In the shadows, a waitress held a tray at shoulder height and went still, glasses dimly ringing against the metal when her hand quivered. The farmer swallowed. The defiance in his spine hadn't gone, but it had to share space with something like shame, or maybe recognition. He had entered prepared to be thrown out, not invited. His lips parted once, closed, then he leaned an inch toward the mic as if confiding to a fire that might go out if he didn't feed it. "I came," he started, then stopped, clearing his throat. "I came to make you hear." The second sentence arrived stronger, the vowels flattened by the South. "Not just me, folks like me. We ain't got the price of a Vegas drink between us most weeks. Somebody has to say it, where it can't be ignored." Soundless agreement moved through pockets of the room like a tide brushing ankles. There, then gone. Elvis listened without blinking. No impatience, no hurry to fold the moment back into music. Up close, his face held the same paradox the nation had argued over for years, a boy's softness strapped to a public monument. You could see the fatigue of a touring machine that never slept. You could also see, plainly as a porch light, the curiosity that made him famous long before the rhinestones did. He took half a step nearer, closing the gap so the farmer wouldn't have to pitch his words across yards of stage. "You know, my people," Elvis said quietly, "you claim your father helped mine. I can't answer for a tale I haven't heard in full, but I can answer for this night. You're here. I'm here. And all these folks are listening. So again, did you come for money, or did you come for truth?" The repetition did something. It was not a trap. It was a door with a latch you only notice when your hand is already on it. The farmer's gaze left the crowd and landed where it had longed to be, on the man he had accused. He gripped the mic properly now, lower on the handle. When he spoke, the shred of rage had burned down to coals. "For truth," he said. A breath moved through the hall like wind in wheat. Security at the wings eased fractionally, not out of relief, but because the scene had changed shape. It was no longer an intrusion. It was an exchange. Elvis shifted his weight the way he did before a song, except there was no arrangement to fall into, no band leader's count. "Truth costs," he said. "It costs me. It costs you. If we're going to spend it in front of all these people, then let it buy something worth keeping." The sentence held no sermon. It sounded like a promise you make to yourself first, and only then to anyone else. From the second row, a man who had shouted earlier now sat with his hands knit tight, knuckles blanched, pupils large. Behind him, two young soldiers on leave leaned forward, their faces open. Suddenly, boys again. A woman with a beehive hairdo whispered a prayer out of habit, more than doctrine. In the balcony, a photographer realized his hands had gone slack and fumbled to raise the camera again. Elvis's eyes shone the way a lake does when a cloud moves off the sun. Not brighter, but clearer. You could read the calculation there, not in the cynical sense, but in the old-fashioned arithmetic of conscience. He was weighing what a stage can bear. He was tallying what part of himself belonged to the contract and what part was still his mother's son from a small southern town. He inclined his head to the farmer, the smallest bow a man can make without surrendering his dignity. "Speak it," he said. "All of it, and I'll answer you straight." Somewhere at the back, a glass cracked against a marble tabletop, and nobody turned. The sound was swallowed by the quiet, like a coin falling into deep water. The farmer looked briefly at his boots, as if to remind himself who had walked them here, then raised his focus and began, not with accusation this time, but with a lineage. Names of fields and neighbors, a chapel with peeling paint, a winter when a hog went missing, and the men took turns sitting up with a rifle. He mentioned Vernon's name without venom, like someone reading it off a gravestone. He spoke of a time when jobs were as scarce as rain. Each sentence landed with the plain authority of a ledger entry. Elvis didn't interrupt. He didn't nod for show. He let the words accumulate, forming a shape that could not be laughed off or drowned in brass. The room listened, the way families listen at kitchen tables when something hard finally gets said after years of circling it. Not every face was sympathetic. Some bristled, some judged. But attention, true attention, held. Standing so close you could hear the faint hiss of the stage monitors, Elvis finally drew breath to respond. Before he did, an older gentleman near the center aisle dabbed at his eye with a folded napkin, as surprised by his own tears as anyone. In the cheap seats, a woman squeezed her husband's hand, and he let her, though he would deny it later. Elvis looked out over them all, then back to the man he had invited into the light. "All right," he said, barely louder than a conversation on a front porch. "You've given me your truth. Now, listen for mine." The room did not move. Even the flashbulbs hesitated, as if afraid to interrupt the hinge on which everything was about to swing. The silence was no longer simple absence of sound. It had weight, as if the chandeliers themselves pressed down upon the audience. The clatter of ice in glasses, the scratch of a chair leg, even the coughs of smokers, all those small intrusions that normally threaded through a performance, were gone. What remained was the dense quiet of thousands waiting for a verdict. The farmer gripped the microphone tighter, the black cord trailing across the stage like a line tethering him to the world he'd just challenged. The glare of the lights made him squint, sweat rolling from his temple despite the air-conditioned chill. His voice, when it came, was stripped bare of theatrics. "You built this on our backs," he said. The words cracked, but didn't falter. "On men who never got out, who stayed bent over soil while you rose up. You don't owe me alone. You owe every man who ever thought your songs came from his life, not from some golden palace." Some in the crowd bristled instantly. One woman, diamonds heavy at her throat, snapped, "This is obscene," while her companion hissed for her to hush. A younger man shouted, "Let him talk," and was met with an echo of, "Yes, let him speak," from the back. The theater fractured into factions before their own ears, the farmer's voice swinging the pendulum of opinion like a heavy weight. He steadied himself, words sharpening. "You sing about loss, about hunger, about prayers that never get answered, but look around you. This room ain't hunger. This ain't loss. These folks came here to watch you sparkle, not to hear the truth of where you came from." He jabbed a finger toward the velvet walls. "That truth is ours, not theirs." The boldness startled even him. His shoulders shook, not from fear, but from the enormity of standing in a place where his voice was never meant to carry. The echo returned from the far wall, smaller, thinner, but undeniably there. Then he reached back further, into a detail that sliced at memory. "My sister," he said, the words slower now, deliberate, "sang in the same church where you sat in Tupelo. She told me how you'd close your eyes when the hymns came, how your mama held your hand so tight it left little white marks on your skin. You sang the same gospels as us. You were one of us. And now—" His throat caught, forcing him to push the words harder. "Now you live in a house with gates of iron and walls too high for a neighbor to see over." A ripple ran through the crowd like a current through water. Those who had clung to the notion of a crazed interloper now felt a chill of recognition. This man knew details too small, too local, to be conjured from fantasy. The scene had shifted from confrontation to testimony. The theater no longer resembled a showroom. It felt closer to a tribunal. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, not as spectators at a concert, but as witnesses to a trial. The accused stood motionless in his bejeweled suit. The accuser trembled in his workman's shirt. And the jury, thousands of strangers, waited to decide which story would claim them. Some clapped nervously, soft bursts that quickly spread. Applause for the courage to speak, not for any agreement with the accusations. Others shouted angrily, outraged that the performance they had paid dearly for was being derailed by a man in boots caked with mud. A woman near the stage dabbed her eyes with the corner of her silk scarf, whispering something about her own family's farm. The sound of division thickened until it seemed the walls might split with it. The guards near the curtain shifted again, one nodding toward Elvis for instruction. He remained still, eyes trained on the farmer. No hint of dismissal, no indulgent smile. It was as if he had slipped into a deeper hearing, listening not only to the man's words, but to the echoes they awoke inside him. The farmer's voice broke into a near shout. "Do you remember? Do you remember those nights? The same dirt roads? The same empty cupboards? Do you remember your mama's tears, or have the lights wiped that from your memory? A sharp cry from the balcony, "That's enough!" collided with another voice yelling, "No! Let him finish!" The air turned feverish, a clash of loyalty and resentment. People stood, some to protest, others to get a clearer view. Waitresses clutched their trays against their chests, uncertain whether to retreat or hold their ground. Elvis's stillness only deepened the intensity. He had not yet spoken again, had not silenced the hall nor granted permission for its chaos. His calm in the center of it all made every gesture, every raised hand in the audience, every muttered curse, seem louder, more volatile. The farmer raised his chin, face contorted between defiance and grief. "This stage don't make you bigger than the rest of us. It makes you louder, that's all. But loud ain't the same as true." His words fell like stones into the quiet pockets between the arguments. One woman gasped audibly. Another clapped once, sharply, before catching herself. Several whispered urgently to each other, voices shaking with either anger or awe. The line between admiration and contempt blurred, leaving only the thick air of confrontation. At that moment, with the farmer's last sentence hanging raw in the rafters, the entire room seemed to freeze. Ushers at the back hallway stopped moving. A bartender mid-pour tilted his bottle, liquid spilling unnoticed. Photographers raised cameras but held their shots, afraid the shutter click would break something sacred. It was no longer spectacle. It was judgment. The farmer lowered the microphone, his chest heaving, as if he had laid down a burden that had dragged him across miles of road and years of silence. His eyes flicked to Elvis, waiting, not for applause, not for scorn, but for recognition. The audience, caught between fury and fascination, leaned inward as one. The space between two men had become the axis of the entire hall. No one knew whether it would turn toward collapse or revelation. And still, Elvis had not spoken. For a long moment, Elvis did nothing. The farmer's words still hung in the room like smoke that refused to clear. Cameras flashed sporadically, but even their white bursts failed to puncture the stillness. Elvis lowered his gaze, and something in his face shifted, an almost imperceptible slackening of the mask he wore for the world. The glare of rhinestones dimmed against the quiet heaviness that fell across him. Inside, the words had unlocked doors he rarely let swing open. The farmer's mention of church hymns, of Tupelo, of his mother's hand gripping his. Those images slipped past the armor of fame and pulled him backward. Suddenly, the stage beneath his feet felt less like Vegas marble and more like the warped wooden boards of the shotgun house where he'd been born. He saw it again. The two-room shack with no insulation, rain dripping through the roof into buckets, the smell of damp boards mixed with fried cornmeal patties, the only dinner many nights. His mother's face, lined with worry even in her youth, her eyes swollen from crying after another bill came unpaid. The sting of being the poor boy at school with patched clothes and shoes worn through to sock. And there was his father. Vernon's shame the year he'd signed that forged check for a hog. A desperate act to put food on the table, an act that landed him in Parchman prison. Elvis remembered the whispers in town, the way neighbors looked at them afterward. He remembered the shame, but also the neighbors who, against their own poverty, had shared scraps to keep Gladys and her boy alive. The farmer's name reverberated in his mind. He hadn't heard it in years, but as it echoed, fragments of memory stitched themselves together. His father once telling him about a man down the road who'd given him a chance at work after the prison years. A man who had lent him a plow mule when they couldn't afford one. The boy Elvis had been didn't know the weight of that gift, but the man he'd become understood. The recognition jolted him, leaving a pulse of shock beneath his calm exterior. For a split second, Elvis's eyes betrayed it, just a flicker. But those close enough to see knew it wasn't nothing. He took the microphone back into his own hand, steady, deliberate. His voice, when it came, had none of the polish of performance. It was quieter, intimate, and it carried an edge of weariness that the microphones could not smooth away. "Maybe you're right," he said. His words didn't fill the hall with grandeur. They crept through it, almost private, but everyone leaned in to catch them. "Maybe your daddy did help mine once. Maybe my family owes yours more than I ever knew." Gasps rippled, disbelief giving way to stunned recognition. For those who had assumed the farmer's tale a drunken invention, the king's acknowledgment lent it the weight of fact. Elvis's gaze fixed on the man, not the crowd. "I can't change what's behind us. I can't repay what was given before I knew the price of it. But tell me, what do you want of me now? What do you ask of me in front of these people?" The farmer's breath hitched. The question wasn't an escape. It was a demand for clarity. Around them, the audience went still again. You could hear the faint hum of the amplifiers, the shuffling of a restless waiter, the pulse of suspense beating like a second heart in the room. Elvis's own heart raced, but he didn't let it show. He stood tall, cape brushing the stage floor. Yet the vulnerability in his words had stripped away the veneer of invincibility. He wasn't the deity of Las Vegas billboards in that instant. He was a son of Tupelo, searching the eyes of another man for some answer to the question of who he had become. The farmer stared at him, jaw clenched, torn between vindication and despair. The stage lights etched every line of hardship into his face. For a long second, he didn't answer. The weight of the moment lay heavy, pressing both men back into the poverty they had once shared, though one had escaped and the other had not. The room itself seemed to teeter on a knife's edge. Patrons leaned forward, caught between the glamour they had paid to witness and the stark, raw truth unfolding instead. They weren't just watching a show. They were part of a reckoning. And Elvis, his chest tight, his mind awash with images of his mother's tears, of the humiliation of welfare lines, of cold nights in a shack, waited, unguarded, for the farmer's reply. The stillness was not absence. It was the very opposite. It was the collective breath of thousands held tight, the air heavy with the knowledge that what came next would either shatter the illusion or bind it tighter than ever. Elvis had given the man the stage, had opened the vault of his own past, and now every soul in the room leaned forward, waiting for the answer that would decide whether the king had been accused or forgiven. The farmer's reply came not as a measured confession, but as a detonation. His grip on the microphone tightened, his shoulders squared, and his voice cracked out with a force that startled even him. "I don't want your money," he roared, the words ricocheting through the vast room. "I don't need your handouts, not here, not ever. What I want is the truth. I want you to stand before these people and remind them you're no king in a castle. You're a boy from dust, just like the rest of us, still clawing at the dirt." The crowd lurched with the shock of his tone. The glitter of the showroom seemed suddenly garish, like costume jewelry under a cruel light. Men in fine suits shouted for him to be removed. Women clutched their purses and pearls as if he might lunge into the seats. Yet there were others. Workers from the hotel staff pressed along the back walls, a handful of veterans in uniform, younger fans with their hair long, who began nodding, drawn toward the resonance in his cry. The farmer's fury rolled on, no longer restrained. "You sing about love. about loss, about struggle. But what about us, still stuck in it? Your voice climbs the charts, but our voices don't leave the fields. You can't stand up here dressed in stones and silk and tell me you remember, unless you say it out loud, unless you make them. He swept an arm toward the glimmering audience. Hear it, too. The sentence ignited something combustible in the room. From the balcony, a woman's voice cut sharply across the air. He's right. I'm from Tupelo, too. Her words cracked against the silence like a whip. Heads twisted upward. The woman stood, plain dress amid sequins, her face flushed, her accent unmistakably Southern. I remember you, Elvis, she called, her voice trembling with conviction. I remember your mama bringing you to Sunday school. We knew you then. You were one of us. The showroom erupted. Cheers clashed with boos, the noise of physical force pressing against the walls. A man in the front row cursed at the woman in the balcony. Another yelled that the farmer should be dragged away. Yet pockets of applause swelled from unexpected corners. Dishwashers allowed into the cheap seats, stagehands hidden along the sides, even a few paying guests whose eyes shone wet with memory. The security detail tensed, muscles coiled, ready to storm the stage. They glanced at Elvis, silently pleading for the command. But before they could move, Elvis raised his hand again, palm outward. The gesture froze them in place, their authority stripped by the refusal of the one man whose word outweighed the rule-book. His voice was calm, but rang with steel. Leave him. The simple instruction detonated another wave of disbelief. Some in the audience gasped, unable to fathom that their idol would allow such disruption. Others leaned forward, hungry for what might follow. Even the band shifted in their seats, clutching instruments, but knowing no arrangement could accompany this scene. The farmer panted into the microphone, chest heaving, eyes wide from the enormity of what he had just unleashed. He hadn't expected permission. He hadn't expected Elvis's composure to endure. He seemed almost stunned by the fact that he was still on stage, still standing, still holding the floor. And then Elvis spoke, voice low but unyielding. Let him speak. Every one of you should hear this. The words rippled through the crowd, unbalancing those who had clung to the safety of spectacle. This was no longer a concert. It was a reckoning, a collision of two lives in front of an audience too vast to look away. Reporters near the back scrambled with notebooks, cameras snapping furiously now, the whir of shutters layering over the clamor. They sensed it. History was being carved in front of them, not rehearsed, not manufactured, but raw and impossible to script. The farmer steadied himself, swallowing hard, then pressed forward with a hoarse determination. Then, let's talk truth. Let's talk about the people who still live like you used to. We still wear the holes in our shoes. We still pray in the same churches. We still bury our children too young. You made it out, but some of us never did. The words didn't just sting. They stripped the glamour from the room like paint peeling from wood. The chandeliers sparkled the same, but now they looked cruel, indifferent. Champagne fizzed in flutes, but the sound was empty against the weight of his grief. Elvis's jaw worked, as if he was grinding down an answer before it came. His eyes swept across the hall, not only the farmer, not only the balcony woman, but every face, every witness to this moment. He could have ended it with one command, one smile, one easy dismissal. Instead, he allowed the storm to roar louder, until the walls seemed to shake with it. The farmer's final cry broke out, shaking in his throat, but steady in its meaning. Don't sing us lullabies, Elvis. Sing us the truth. The sentence landed heavy. echoing against the hushed breath of thousands. And in that instant, everyone knew. The concert they had come to see no longer existed. The glittering Vegas spectacle had been replaced by something far rarer, far more dangerous. An open wound on stage, shared by two men and witnessed by a nation. The question now was whether Elvis would let it bleed, or find a way to stitch it shut before the night was lost. The hall quivered with energy that no orchestra could tame, all eyes fixed on the man in white. He stood center stage, rhinestones catching the heat of the spotlights, his cape hanging heavy across his shoulders. Yet nothing about him glistened now. His silence had grown unbearable, stretching across the crowd until even the rustle of a dress or the click of a lighter felt intrusive. Thousands of people leaned forward, waiting to see which path he would take. Elvis could have ended it instantly. One word, one nod, and the guards would have dragged the farmer off stage, restoring the glittering veneer of the show. He could have leaned into his legend, smiled that familiar smile, and drowned the moment beneath applause. Instead, he inhaled slowly, as though preparing to lift something far heavier than any cape. He raised the microphone, his hand steady, his voice measured. "I was born in a house with no paint on the walls," he said. The crowd hushed, shocked by the sudden intimacy of his tone. "2 rooms, that's all. My mama cried at night, 'cause she couldn't make ends meet. We didn't have much more than faith and a few kind neighbors." The farmer's eyes flickered with recognition. The balcony woman nodded fiercely, her hand pressed against her chest. A murmur ran through the audience. Not outrage now, but astonishment. Elvis continued, words dropping like stones into water. "I wore shoes with holes in them. I remember stuffing cardboard inside just to keep the ground off my feet. I remember days when supper was cornbread and nothing else. I remember the sound of my daddy's shame when he couldn't give us better." His throat tightened, but he didn't break. "That's where I come from. Same as you." The room shifted again. The applause that some had expected never came. Not yet. Instead, there was listening, raw and total. Even the reporters stopped scribbling for a moment, pens hovering above paper, transfixed. Elvis turned his gaze directly to the farmer. "But here's the truth I've wrestled with since all this began." He gestured to the bright lights, the vast room, the ocean of faces. "Sometimes I do forget. Sometimes I get lost in contracts, in money, in rooms that smell of perfume instead of sweat. And when that happens—" He paused, lowering his voice until it felt almost like confession. "When that happens, I feel ashamed." Gasps rippled through the audience. No one expected the admission. This was not performance. It was vulnerability, carved raw in front of strangers. Elvis pressed on. "You ask me what I owe. I owe my family. I owe the people who bought my records. I owe every man and woman who believed my songs spoke for them. And I owe the truth, that I came from nothing, and that I never should forget it." He stepped closer to the farmer, so near the crowd could feel the intimacy of their exchange. "So hear me when I say, you are right to remind me. You are right to stand here and demand it." The farmer's expression crumbled, torn between pride and grief. His chest heaved, his grip on the microphone weakening. He had expected rejection, not acknowledgement. Elvis wasn't finished. He turned back to the audience, scanning the glittering sea of faces. "I'll tell you this much. If ever I forget where I come from again, if I get too lost in this world of lights, remind me. Even if it's here, even if it's ugly, don't let me lose that part of myself." For the first time all night, the crowd broke. A ripple of applause swelled, uncertain at first, then growing, spreading through the hall until it was a tide. It wasn't the hysterical roar that usually greeted his performances. It was slower, steadier, reverent. Some clapped with tears on their cheeks. Others simply bowed their heads as though they had witnessed a sermon instead of a show. The farmer lowered his eyes, shoulders trembling. He had entered the stage to accuse. Now he found himself seen in a way that disarmed him. He blinked hard, fighting the sting of tears, but they welled anyway. Elvis placed a hand gently on his shoulder. The gesture, small as it was, carried the weight of reconciliation. Then he lifted the microphone again, his voice rich with both sorrow and resolve. "Tonight," he said, "the songs can wait. First, the truth needed to be spoken." A hush fell again, softer now, like the quiet after a storm. The moment had changed the room. The glitter of the showroom dimmed, replaced by the gravity of honesty. The audience, once divided between jeers and cheers, now found themselves bound in a single thread of stillness. The question lingering in every heart was the same. How would Elvis follow such a declaration? Would he return to the spectacle, pretending nothing had happened? Or would he step further into the unknown, answering not with words, but with music that bared the wound even deeper? The choice lay with him, and everyone in the hall knew they were balanced at the edge of something unforgettable. The applause faded into a fragile hush, as though the room itself feared to disturb whatever fragile balance had been struck. Elvis lowered his hand from the farmer's shoulder and turned back toward the orchestra pit. The musicians sat frozen, horns resting in laps, guitarists gripping necks, waiting for a cue that had never come before. The set list for the evening lay abandoned at their feet, like a script no longer relevant. Elvis leaned into the microphone, his voice calm but edged with command. "Stop. Play me something different." A ripple of confusion passed through the band. Then he spoke again, clearer this time, naming the piece. "In the Ghetto." Gasps scattered across the showroom. The number wasn't on the night's program. It wasn't one of the grand showstoppers, not one of the glittering Vegas anthems meant to dazzle the tourists. It was a song of hunger, of poverty, of cycles that swallowed children whole. Choosing it here, now, in this hall of velvet and jewels, was nothing less than audacious. The conductor gave a sharp nod, and the opening chords rose, soft, mournful, the sound of a story too familiar to dismiss. Elvis gripped the microphone with both hands, eyes closing, shutting out the chandeliers, the sequins, the flashbulbs. When he began to sing, the words didn't arrive polished. They carried the raw gravel of memory, each line trembling with the weight of lived truth. As the snow flies. The audience stilled. Even those who had come only for spectacle felt the words pierce through the glitter. The melody crawled into the rafters, and with it came the undeniable realization. He wasn't performing now. He was confessing. The farmer stood a few feet away, Mike lowered at his side, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. He had expected argument, dismissal, maybe even humiliation. Instead, he found himself pulled into the current of the song, powerless against it. His jaw trembled. He raised a hand once, as though to steady himself, and let it fall again. The lyrics painted images the crowd could no longer ignore. A child born into poverty, trapped in a cycle of neglect and despair, his life marked by hunger and violence. For some in the room, it was a story they had never lived. For others, it was their own reflection. And for Elvis, it was a piece of his childhood carved into melody. As he sang, something extraordinary happened. The crowd, once fractured into opposing camps, began to merge. Women who had shouted for the farmer's removal now pressed handkerchiefs to their cheeks. Men who had cursed him shifted in their seats, unease etched across their faces. The hotel staff, clustered in the shadows, let their tears fall freely. The song stripped away divisions, forcing every ear to confront the truth in its verses. The farmer could not hold himself steady any longer. Midway through the second verse, his body sagged, and his other hand came up to cover his face. His shoulders shook. The man who had stormed the stage, burning with fury, now wept openly before thousands. Flashbulbs caught the moment. The contrast of rhinestone-clad king and broken man in boots side by side, united by grief too deep for words. Elvis's voice swelled, not loud but aching, carrying through every corner of the hall. The orchestra, sensing the magnitude of the moment, played with restraint, leaving space for his phrasing to cut clean. Each note landed heavy, pressing into the silence left between verses. By the time he reached the closing lines, the room had surrendered. And then it ended. No cymbal crash, no triumphant chord. Just silence, absolute and total. So complete you could hear the faint hum of the stage lights and the muffled sob of someone near the back. Cameras clicked, but even the shutter seemed intrusive, as though capturing something too raw to be frozen. Elvis lowered the microphone slowly, breathing hard, sweat beading along his temples. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply looked at the farmer, then at the audience, his chest rising and falling with the aftershock of what he had just laid bare. The farmer dropped his gaze, covering his face with both hands now. He wasn't hiding from shame. He was overcome by recognition, by the knowledge that his anger had been answered not with defiance, but with song. For the first time all evening, his knees buckled. He caught himself, gripping the microphone stand for balance. And the audience? They didn't cheer. Not yet. They sat suspended, caught between the spectacle they had come for and the truth they had just received. The room felt less like a showroom and more like a church, filled not with applause but with reverence, as though they had witnessed something sacred. A murmur rose, faint at first, then spreading. Not the roar of adoration, but the quiet gasp of people who had been shaken awake. In that fragile stillness, Elvis's answer was complete. He hadn't argued. He hadn't denied. He had sung the truth into being. The spell would break soon. It always did. But for that moment, every soul in the International Hotel was bound together by the sound of one man daring to sing poverty into a palace of gold. When the final note dissolved, the crowd did not erupt in the usual thunder. They sat suspended, as though waking from a dream that had unsettled them too deeply to clap on instinct. For nearly half a minute, the International Hotel was silent, except for the faint hum of lights and the muffled sob of a woman in the balcony. Then, slowly, applause began. Not the manic cheers reserved for his most flamboyant performances, but a slow, deliberate rhythm, hands striking together with reverence. The sound grew, swelling into a tidal wave of gratitude more than celebration. Elvis did not smile. He did not throw kisses or wave. He stood still, chest rising heavily, sweat tracing lines along his temple. The farmer remained at his side, face streaked, clutching the microphone stand for balance. Elvis turned, placed a hand gently at the man's back, and guided him toward the edge of the stage. It was not spectacle. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared humanity. Security moved in, cautious now, unsure if they should intervene. Elvis shook his head once, firmly, and the men retreated. The farmer descended the steps, trembling, swallowed by the crowd that parted like water around him. Some jeered as he passed, but others touched his shoulder as though blessing a pilgrim. By the time he disappeared into the aisles, his image had already fixed itself in the minds of everyone present. The lone man who had dared to stop the king, and the king who had listened. The concert limped back into motion after that, though nothing could follow what had happened. Elvis sang again, yes, but the songs felt changed, imbued with weight they had not carried before. Even his biggest numbers were received differently, not as pure entertainment, but as extensions of the truth he had already revealed. When the curtain finally closed, the ovation that followed was less about showmanship and more about gratitude for a night no one could have predicted. By dawn, Las Vegas was buzzing. Newspapers rushed to print, reporters working feverishly from their notes, and the hurried film developed in darkrooms. The Las Vegas Sun ran its morning edition with a front-page headline, "Farmer confronts Elvis on stage. King responds with tears and song." Other outlets followed. "Truth in the spotlight," wrote one. "Presley faces his past in public showdown," declared another. National syndicates carried the story within hours. Radio hosts debated whether it was a stunt, though those in the hall swore it was raw, unrehearsed, unforgettable. Photographs circulated by midday. Elvis mid-song, eyes clenched in anguish. The farmer weeping under the spotlight. The two men standing side by side, one in rhinestones, the other in boots cracked from labor. The images seemed almost biblical, like parables staged on a modern altar of neon and velvet. But what the papers didn't capture was the aftermath away from the cameras. Word spread quietly among the hotel staff that Elvis had asked for the man's name. Had someone tracked down where he was staying? A few days later, it leaked, never confirmed, never publicized in Elvis's own voice, that the farmer's debts had been cleared, his family provided for, his children sent clothes and supplies. Elvis had made sure of it personally, insisting no announcement be made. Those who had been in the showroom carried the story differently than the headlines. They didn't talk only of scandal or disruption. They spoke of the silence after the song, the moment when the lights seemed to dim and the glitter no longer mattered. They described the way Elvis had listened, truly listened, to a voice from his past. Some said they felt they had seen not a star, but a man, one who could hold power without crushing the fragile truth laid before him. And as the years went on, the tale took on a life of its own. It was retold in bars and barber shops, in farms and small-town churches. It became less about Las Vegas, and more about what it meant for a man to remember his roots in the face of unimaginable fame. For some, it was proof that Elvis Presley had never completely left Tupelo behind. For others, it was a warning that even kings could be summoned to account. Those who were there never forgot the image. The spotlights cutting across rhinestones and denim alike. The chandeliers glimmering above, a silence as deep as prayer, and a farmer in worn boots who forced the king of rock and roll to stand once more among his people. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of the night. Not the set list, not the glitter, not the scandal of headlines, but the simple fact that for one brief, unrepeatable moment, the walls between a stage and its audience crumbled, and what remained was nothing more and nothing less than truth.